re-examine everything we thought we knew. So it's kind of opened up this whole new world of First American studies.
A pond in Florida became a perfect time machine, sealed by nature for over 7 millennia. When it was accidentally opened in 1982, it revealed a look at a lost world. Over 160 individuals were found, their bodies wrapped in the oldest known fabrics on the continent.
You could see it. It was a piece of 7,000+ year-old twine. It was, in a sense, as good as the day it was manufactured. You could see the twist, and it was obvious. This was hand-woven fabric.
But the real secret was locked inside their DNA. Scientists uncovered a genetic connection that breaks all known models of human migration. It's a link that shouldn't be there, and it points to a journey that seems impossible. Stopping the dig. An unbelievable find. The story of the Windover people begins not in a pristine lab or on a grand expedition, but with the rumble of heavy machinery. The year was 1982. The place was Titusville, Florida, a town booming with new construction. A crew was clearing land for a new housing development called Windover Farms. It was hot, sticky, and just another Tuesday. A backhoe operator named Steve was digging up peat from a shallow pond, clearing the way for a new road. That's when he hit something. It wasn't a soft thud, but a hard, scraping crack. He figured it was just another pine log buried in the dark, heavy muck. But here's the catch. When he pulled the scoop back, he saw it. Sticking out of the wet peat was not wood, but a human skull, stained dark brown by thousands of years in the bog. In an instant, the entire construction site went silent. The police were called immediately. Everyone on site assumed the worst. This was a grim, modern-day unsolved case, perhaps a dumping ground for a criminal. Caution tape went up and investigators began the messy, grim work of combing through the pond. But as they uncovered more remains, the story got stranger and a whole lot older. They found not one, but dozens of individuals, and they weren't recent. The bones were ancient, stained, and buried with an unmistakable sense of order. This wasn't a modern-day tragedy. This was a cemetery, an ancient underwater cemetery. The landowner, Jack Eckerd, made a call that would change American history. Instead of bulldozing ahead to meet a deadline, he paid for a full-scale archaeological investigation. What they found was something no one had ever seen in North America. The site wasn't just old, it was ancient. And the preservation? It was borderline miraculous. So here's the deal. The Windover Pond was a perfect natural time capsule. The reason was the peat. Peat bogs like this pond create a very special environment. The water and decomposing plants create a brew that is extremely low in oxygen and high in acidic tannins. This combination stops the bacteria that cause decay right in their tracks. It essentially pickles organic material. The bodies hadn't rotted away to skeletons. They were preserved, tanned like leather over thousands of years. As archaeologists, led by Glenn Doran from Florida State University, began their careful, painstaking excavation, the true scale of the discovery became clear. They weren't just digging in the water, they had to build a complex system of dams and pumps, lowering the water table just enough to work, but not enough to let oxygen in and destroy the site. They eventually found the remains of over 160 individuals, from tiny infants to elderly adults. And they hadn't just been tossed in, they had been laid to rest. Each person was carefully folded into a fetal position, lying on their left side with their heads pointing to the west, perhaps towards the setting sun. This was a ritual. This was a community. But the most incredible part was what was still intact. The peat had preserved things that should have turned to dust millennia ago. They found light, leathery skin, and even the remnants of clothing. The bodies were wrapped in sophisticated hand-woven textiles. These fabrics, made from plant fibers like sabal palm, were 7,000 years old. Get this, that makes them some of the oldest, most complex woven textiles ever found on the entire planet. They were older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. This find alone changed what experts thought about the skills of these ancient hunter-gatherers. Then came the real wow moment. The discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Inside the skulls, something impossible was waiting. Because the decay had been stopped so quickly, the peat had preserved the brains. In over 90 of the skulls, archaeologists found shrunken, leathery masses of ancient brain tissue. It was, and still is, the largest find of prehistoric human brains in the world. At the time, they were a stunning curiosity. But decades later, those preserved brains would become a genetic bombshell. They held a secret, a tiny strand of DNA that would challenge the entire accepted story of how humanity first came to the Americas. The story of who these people were was just as shocking as the brains. A life lived in rhythm. The DNA mystery makes Windover famous, but what the artifacts and bones tell us about their lives is, in some ways, even more profound. These weren't the brutish cavemen people often imagine, struggling for survival. The Windover people were artists, engineers, and most importantly, a deeply compassionate community. What most people don't realize is that archaeology can often see kindness. And the bones at Windover were shouting it. Several skeletons showed clear evidence of long-term care for severe injuries and disabilities. One man had a badly crushed foot, an injury so severe it would have made it impossible for him to walk, hunt, or gather food. In a survival of the fittest world, he would have been left behind. Yet his bones show he lived for years after the injury, which had healed as well as it could. The only way that happens is if someone brought him food, water, and protected him every single day. The most moving case was that of a teenage boy. He had been born with spina bifida, a severe congenital condition that would have left him paralyzed from the waist down. Yet he had lived to be about 15 years old. His bones showed signs of care. His teeth were in good condition, meaning he was well fed. This small, tight-knit community had spent 15 years caring for a child who could not walk, hunt, or contribute in any physical way. This wasn't a band of ruthless survivors. This was a family, and their skills were just as sharp as their empathy. Let's talk about those fabrics again. When archaeologists looked at them under a microscope, they were stunned. They found 7 different types of complex weaves, some designed for strength, others for flexibility, and some for delicate, intricate patterns. This wasn't just covering up, this was fashion. It was identity. It was knowledge passed down through generations. They were turning plants from the swamp into art 7,000 years ago. Their toolkits were just as impressive. They had finely crafted tools made from bone and antler. They had wooden digging sticks and even a paddle, suggesting they used canoes. This was a people who had mastered their environment. Their diet told a similar story of sophistication. By analyzing the preserved stomach contents, another miracle of the peat bog, scientists painted a picture of a life lived in perfect balance with the Florida landscape. They ate fish, turtles, deer, and small game, but they also ate a huge variety of plants. Elderberries, wild grapes, prickly pears, and the seeds of the sable palm. They weren't just wandering and hoping to find food, they were planners. They understood the seasons. They knew when to fish, when to harvest, and how to store food. Basically, they were thriving. But this complex, tender picture is exactly what makes the next part so baffling. As archaeologists were studying the burial customs, some noticed a strange echo, a parallel that was spooky to say the least. Thousands of miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in the peat bogs of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, other ancient remains had been found. These are the famous bog bodies of places like Sweden and Finland. And get this, their burial rituals from around the same time period were almost identical to Windover. The European bog bodies were also often laid to rest in a fetal position. They were also frequently wrapped in woven textiles. Many were also placed on wooden platforms beneath shallow water, just like the Windover people who were staked to the pond bottom with wooden poles. And in many cases, their heads were also turned to the west. At first, scientists brushed this off. It had to be a coincidence, right? 2 separate cultures an ocean apart just happening to develop the exact same, highly specific burial rituals. It's called independent invention. But the similarities were so precise, so uncanny that it made some researchers deeply uncomfortable. It was a puzzle, a cultural connection that shouldn't exist, and it was just the first clue that something about the Windover people was not what it seemed. The genetic code was about to turn this puzzle into a paradox. The code in the brain. The idea of getting usable DNA from a 7,000-year-old brain sounds like pure science fiction, and in the 1980s, it basically was. The technology was in its infancy. Researchers back then did what they could. They confirmed the remains were human and that they had broad biological markers consistent with other ancient Native American populations. This fit the story everyone knew. The story taught in every school is that the first Americans arrived around 13 to 15,000 years ago. They came from Asia, crossing the Bering Land Bridge, a massive stretch of land called Beringia that connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. From there, they spread south, populating 2 continents. It was a simple, clean, and accepted theory. The Windover people were just an early southern branch of that family tree. Yeah, about that. Fast forward a couple of decades. DNA technology exploded. What was once impossible became routine. Scientists could now analyze tiny, degraded fragments of ancient DNA with incredible precision. A new team of researchers decided to take another look at the Windover brain tissue. This time, they weren't just looking at broad markers. They were targeting a specific type of genetic code, mitochondrial DNA. Here's the deal. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down only from the mother. It remains almost unchanged for thousands of generations, making it the perfect tool for tracking deep ancestry, like a genetic surname. All Native American populations, from the Inuit in the Arctic to the Mapuche in Patagonia, trace their roots back to 5 founder mtDNA lines, known as haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X. 95% of all indigenous Americans belong to A, B, C, or D. A tiny fraction, about 3%, belong to haplogroup X. The scientists expected to find one of those 5. That was the test. The results would just tell them which branch of the family the Windover people belonged to. The results came back. The scientists checked them. And they were wrong. They had to be wrong. The Windover DNA didn't match A, B, C, or D. It did match X. But not the right kind of X. The crazy part is, the genetic signature they found, this specific haplogroup X, was not the one commonly found in Native Americans, known as X2A. Instead, its closest relatives were found in one, and only one, other place on Earth, the ancient populations of Western Eurasia, modern-day Europe and the Middle East. This was not a contamination. They tested it again and again. The pattern held. A 7,000-year-old man in Florida had a genetic lineage that looked European. This should not exist. This finding was explosive. It was scientific heresy. It flew in the face of the single sacred Bering Land Bridge theory, and it poured gasoline on one of the most controversial and ridiculed theories in archaeology, the Solutrean hypothesis. What is that? It's the idea, put forth by archaeologists Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, that some of the first people in the Americas did not come from Asia. They came from Ice Age Europe, specifically from the Solutrean culture of modern-day France and Spain around 20,000 years ago. The theory goes that these Ice Age hunters didn't walk, they paddled. They were a maritime people, hunting seals and fish along the edge of the massive ice sheets that covered the North Atlantic. They supposedly hopped from ice floe to ice floe in skin boats all the way across the ocean, landing in what is now the east coast of the United States. For decades, this theory was laughed out of the room. The main proof was based on tools. The Solutreans made beautiful leaf-shaped spear points. The oldest known culture in America, the Clovis people, also made beautiful leaf-shaped spear points. The two looked eerily similar, but the counter-argument was massive. First, there was a 5,000-year gap in the timeline between the two cultures. And second, the idea of an Ice Age boat trip across the Atlantic was seen as pure fantasy. But now, Windover. Here was a 7,000-year-old population in Florida not far from the coast with DNA that looked Eurasian, and they were buried just like ancient Scandinavians. The Bog Brothers parallel suddenly looked less like a coincidence and more like a clue. The Solutrean theory, once a joke, was suddenly being discussed in serious, hushed tones. But the plot was about to get even thicker with more wild theories. Edgar Cayce's Florida prophecies. The Solutrean hypothesis was already a massive stretch for mainstream science, but the Windover discovery opened a Pandora's box of other, even wilder theories. What we're told in school is just the simplest version. The truth, as people who look for mysteries know, is often buried deeper. The problem wasn't just Windover, it was other skeletons too. In 1996, a skeleton was found in Kennewick, Washington. He was dubbed Kennewick Man and he was over 9,000 years old. But his features were the issue. The initial analysis of his skull suggested he didn't look like modern Native Americans. The features were described as Caucasoid-like. This, of course, caused a massive firestorm both scientifically and culturally as Native American tribes fought for his reburial, similar to the battle over the Spirit Cave mummy. But it created a pattern: a 9,000-year-old European-looking man on the West Coast and a 7,000-year-old population with Eurasian DNA on the East Coast. It's not that simple, though. The data was piling up and it suggested the Beringia-only model was in trouble. So let's look at the really wild theories. Theory number 1, the Atlantis connection. Yeah, about that. We have to go there. For over a century, mystics and researchers have looked for the lost continent of Atlantis. While many place it in the Mediterranean or the Mid-Atlantic, a surprising number of theories point straight to the Caribbean and Florida. The famous sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce claimed in the 1930s that Atlantis was a real place, a highly advanced civilization that destroyed itself in a cataclysm. He predicted that parts of Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas in the late 1960s. And what happened? In 1968, the Bimini Road, a massive underwater rock formation that looks like a man-made wall or pavement, was discovered. What most people don't realize is that Case also claimed that refugees from Atlantis fled to other parts of the world, including Egypt and the Americas. So here's the deal. Here we have the Windover people living in Florida 7,000 years ago after the supposed final sinking of Atlantis. They are a culture of unexplained sophistication with weaving technology that baffled experts. They had advanced medical compassion and a genetic link that science can't explain. Could the Windover people be a relict population? The last distant descendants of survivors from a lost advanced civilization like Atlantis? A group that held on to their ancient traditions like weaving and specific burial rites for millennia? It sounds crazy, but the timeline fits. Theory number 2, the lost continent of Mu. If one lost continent isn't enough, how about 2? The idea of Mu, or Lemuria, was a proposed continent in the Pacific. What if the migration didn't come from the Atlantic but the Pacific? This opens up a whole new can of worms. Everyone is obsessed with the Atlantic crossing, but the Pacific is vast. The explorer Thor Heyerdahl proved with his Kon-Tiki expedition that ancient peoples could cross the Pacific in simple rafts. We also know that Polynesians were master navigators crossing thousands of miles of open ocean. What if Haplogroup X didn't come from Europe or Asia? What if it came from a now vanished third civilization in the Pacific and they spread in both directions, east to the Americas and west to Eurasia? This would explain why the DNA appears in both places without them ever having to meet. The Windover people and the ancient Europeans would be cousins, both stemming from a much older, lost homeland. Theory number 3, a global ancient seafaring culture. This theory is a bit more grounded, but just as mind-blowing. What if the primitive in primitive man is just wrong? What if 20 or 30,000 years ago there was a global network of coastal seafaring people? They wouldn't have been crossing the middle of the ocean. They would have been kelp highway hopping, following the coastlines of the continents. We know the Ice Age locked up so much water that sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. This means their highways, their coastal settlements, are all now deep underwater, lost to history. In this model, the Bering Land Bridge wasn't the only way in. It was just one way. These seafaring people could have come from Europe, from Africa, from Australia, or from Asia, all at different times over tens of thousands of years. If this is true, then the Windover people weren't an anomaly. They were the norm. They were one of just many, many different groups that made it to the Americas. And the reason their DNA looks Eurasian is simple. They were Eurasian. They just got here 7,000 years ago, while other groups got here 15,000 years ago. This would mean the Americas weren't populated in one event, but were a melting pot for millennia. The science is messy, the theories are wild, and the Windover people are silent. But what does the latest science actually say? The ghost population in the DNA. We've gone deep down the rabbit hole. We've talked Atlantis, global sea voyagers, and lost continents. People watching this are looking for a mystery, and Windover provides one. But here's the thing. Is it true? Are we missing a key detail? Let's talk down to earth like we're talking to a friend and look at what the mainstream scientists, the ones who have to stake their reputations on this, really think. First, let's clean up the other mysteries. Kennewick Man? The one with the Caucasoid-like features? In 2015, scientists finally got permission to run his DNA. The results were conclusive. He was not European, not at all. He was, in fact, a direct ancestor of modern Native Americans, most closely related to the very tribes who were fighting to rebury him. The European features were just an example of ancient genetic diversity, not a different origin. The Solutrean hypothesis. That 5,000-year gap between the Solutrean tools and the Clovis tools? It's still there. No one has found a missing link tool, and the idea of crossing the North Atlantic ice in skin boats, while not impossible, is seen as incredibly unlikely compared to the walking across a continent option. So what about the Windover DNA? What about haplogroup X? This is the key detail. This is the wow factor that started it all. And the answer is both simpler and more complex than Atlantis. The geneticists who found the European link were right, but also wrong. It's all in the name. They found a link to Western Eurasia. They did not find a link to Ice Age France. The haplogroup they found, X, is also found in small numbers in a place in Asia, right near the Altai Mountains. And guess where the Altai Mountains are? They are right next to the area where the other 4 haplogroups, A, B, C, and D, came from. So here's the most likely and least dramatic answer. The Windover people were not Europeans. They were not Atlanteans. They were Asians. They were part of the same migration across the Bering Land Bridge as all other Native Americans. The crazy part is, they were just rare. Think of the migration as a massive crowd of people walking from Siberia to Alaska. 95% of them had genetic tags A, B, C, or D. But mixed in that crowd, say 3% of them, was a small group with the X tag. All of them started in Asia. All of them crossed together. When they got to the Americas, they split up. The A, B, C, and D groups went everywhere and were super successful. The X group, being smaller, was less common. A small branch of them, known as X2A, made their way down to the East Coast, and one tiny community ended up in a pond in Florida. The reason their DNA also looks like DNA from Europe is because haplogroup X is an ancient line. It started in Eurasia, and one branch went west into Europe, while another branch went east into Siberia, and then into the Americas. They are not mother and daughter, they are cousins separated by 30,000 years. The Windover people, in all likelihood, were a relict population, a genetic ghost. They were a snapshot of a rare lineage that survived, isolated in Florida for millennia, preserving a genetic signature that had long since vanished from other places. So is the mystery solved? Not quite. The real mystery of Windover isn't where they came from. The real mystery is who they were. Why did they and ancient Scandinavians an ocean apart both choose to bury their departed in the exact same tender, ritualistic way? Why did this tiny community 7,000 years ago show a level of compassion for the sick and disabled that we would call modern today? How did they develop weaving technology that was, quite literally, world-class? The genetic link that shouldn't exist turned out to be a red herring. But it forced us to look at this pond. And in it, we found something more incredible than any wild theory. A clear, perfectly preserved window into the heart of a 7,000-year-old community. They weren't just primitive, they were people. Echoes in the peat. The story of the Windover people seems to settle into a neat academic conclusion. The genetic bombshell, haplogroup X, is diffused by the Altai Mountains hypothesis. This theory suggests the European genetic marker simply took a long walk east into Siberia and across the Bering Land Bridge with all the other founding populations. The Windover people were not European cousins. They were simply a rare branch of the same Asian family tree. The eerie similarity of their bog burials to those in Scandinavia is dismissed as convergent cultural evolution. Two separate peoples, an ocean apart, just happening to invent the exact same, highly specific funeral rite. Case closed. The mystery is solved. But is it? This tidy explanation, while comfortable, deliberately ignores the unsettling static that remains. It sweeps the most profound anomalies under the rug. To accept this conclusion, you must believe in a series of staggering coincidences. And in the quest for truth, a coincidence is often just a clue we haven't understood. Let's pull at those loose threads. The Altai explanation for haplogroup X2A, the specific Windover lineage, is tenuous at best. This exact genetic marker is not found in the Altai. Only its distant ancestors are. X2A is, for all intents and purposes, a uniquely American haplogroup. To say it came from the Altai is like finding a specific unique surname in rural Florida and finding no trace of it in New York, declaring it must have come from England simply because other distantly related English surnames are found there. The genetic trail from Asia is not a highway. It's a cold, broken path. This is where the truly wild theories find their footing, rooted in the very data that mainstream science seeks to quiet. What if the Solutrean hypothesis isn't wrong, but just incomplete? The 5,000-year gap between the Solutrean hunters of Europe and the Clovis people of America is the primary argument against it. But what if that gap is an illusion? Recent world-shaking discoveries, like the 23,000-year-old human footprints preserved in White Sands, New Mexico, or the mind-boggling 130,000-year-old Cerruti mastodon site in California, suggest human beings were in the Americas tens of thousands of years before the Bering Land Bridge was even considered the main route. If people were here 23,000 years ago, the Solutreans, with their advanced skin boats and maritime hunting skills, would not have been arriving in an empty land. They would have been just one migration among many. Perhaps they didn't just cross, perhaps they fled. The period of the Solutrean culture, around 21,000 years ago, was the peak of the last ice age, an event of brutal, world-ending cold called the last glacial maximum. What if their journey was not one of exploration, but of desperation, a handful of boats running from a dying, frozen world, following the kelp highway of the ice shelf to a new continent? This opens a door to a more radical idea, a two-wave Atlantic theory. The first wave, the Solutreans. Around 21,000 years ago, these Ice Age Europeans make the journey. They are few in number. They bring their tool-making skills, which become Clovis, and their DNA, haplogroup X. They are the ghost population that science detects. The second wave, the Bog Brothers, millennia pass. The ice recedes. Their descendants, the Windover people, are now established in Florida. Then, around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, a new contact happens. This isn't an invasion, but perhaps just a few boats of Neolithic or megalithic European fishermen blown off course. They share no genes, but they share ideas. They carry with them the advanced burial customs that have become common in their homeland, the fetal position, the westward gaze, the sacred peat bog. The Windover people, recognizing an echo of their own long-lost ancestral rites, adopt and perfect this ritual. This cultural echo theory would explain everything. It explains the Eurasian DNA and the identical European ritual, two things that the mainstream Beringia-only model cannot do without invoking massive coincidence. But we can go wilder. What if the link is not human at all? Some have proposed that the true connection is geological, not genetic. The peat bogs of Florida and Scandinavia are not just similar. They are specific, unique chemical environments. What if the perfect preservation is not an accident but a clue? What if these bogs, rich in specific tannins and acids, interact with the human body in a way that alters or selectively preserves certain mitochondrial DNA markers, making the X haplogroup appear more prominent or even creating a similar signature? In this view, the bog itself is the link. So, what do you think? Is the scientific explanation the real one, or is it just the safest one? Does a shared ritual across an ocean mean nothing? Let us know your theory in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysteries.